Dragon Ball. The biggest anime in the entire world is taking it by storm once again, as it wraps up the Dragon Ball Super series, and in the world of video games, people go crazy over the character creation of Xenoverse or the insane fighting game mechanics in fighters. But Dragon Ball wasn't always as big as it is today, and games-wise, it had very humble beginnings. My name is Globku, and this is part 1 of our history and evolution of the Dragon Ball games. Today we'll be looking at the first Dragon Ball games ever created. Most of them only came out in Japan, so I'll be translating some of the titles myself, making it easier for you to follow along our complete history. Sit back and enjoy the ride. Welcome to the history and evolution of Dragon Ball games. February 1986. Japanese TVs received the first images of Dragon Ball. A little child with a tail, who was surprisingly strong, lived at his grandfather's house and looked over his treasure, the 4-star Dragon Ball. 7 months later, the first Dragon Ball game was made. Dragon Ball Great Exploration came out on the Super Cassette Vision, a console from the same generation as the NES. This was the first time Goku was in a video game, and this was the only game developed or published by someone who was not Bandai or Bandai Namco. It was made by Epoch, the same company that manufactured the console, but unfortunately for them, the NES was taking the world by storm. These simplistic games were not doing it for gamers anymore. The simplistic controller was no longer enough. The NES had figured out what we wanted, so this console ended up being forgotten as everyone got an NES. But this game, made by Epoch on an Epoch console, was and will always be the first Dragon Ball game ever made. It didn't take long for Bandai to pick up the license and start putting out games on the most popular console at the time. Only 2 months after Great Exploration came the first Dragon Ball game on the NES. Dragon Ball Shenron's Riddle. This was an action RPG that came out on the same year as a little game called The Legend of Zelda. Similar to Zelda, this was also an RPG where you would explore levels to get items such as power-ups or the power pole, but unlike Zelda, it was more of a linear game and less of an open world. And on boss fights, the game would actually switch to a side-scroller. In Europe, the game was translated to French, but in America, the game changed drastically. It came out as Dragon Power, featuring this beautiful cover art. You may notice that with the exception of the dragon, there's not a lot of Dragon Ball in this cover, and that's because in America, this wasn't even a Dragon Ball game. At this point, Dragon Ball had only come out in Japan, so there was no reason to license that property in the US. So what America did was take the Japanese game and base it upon the novels that Dragon Ball itself is based on. If you didn't know, Dragon Ball itself is loosely based upon a Chinese classic novel, The Journey to the West. Journey to the West is public domain, which means no one needs to pay licensing fees to use characters or take inspiration from its narrative, which is why you see so many Monkey King or Sun Wukong characters in other video games, like League of Legends, Dota, Warframe, or even Overwatch, which has a Wukong skin for Winston. Dragon Power is essentially the same game as Shenron's Riddle, but they replaced Goku's sprite with a monkey and changed the names of a lot of characters and moves. For instance, the Kamehameha is called the Wind Wave, and the Dragon Balls are referred to as the Crystal Balls. After that, we would have to wait 2 years before another Dragon Ball game was released, as Bandai started working on something quite different. A new style of game that would define Dragon Ball games for over 5 years, with a total of 7 games released within that style for the NES. This is what we call the Goku series. It started as a text adventure with Dragon Ball The Demon King's Revival. You've got a few options on what to do. You arrive at the Kame house, you search different parts of the house, you find the Dragon Radar, you find Krillin's dead body, you know, Dragon Ball things. And then you leave the house and find out that exploration and combat both use randomly generated cards, which ended up defining the Goku series. Each card has a Dragon Ball, an effect, and a number, and depending on the Dragon Ball, your card will win or lose the duel against your opponent's card. If it wins, you trigger the effect, and the number usually represents how strong that effect will be. And that's pretty much how combat works in all of the games from this series. For movement and exploration, you would move in this board-like map to reach your destination, and once again, you move using the cards. 1 year later, they released Dragon Ball 3 Goku's Story. Why the number 3? Because it's the third game on the NES. That's it. That's the only reason. It didn't need to be related to the previous games. In fact, it's definitely not related to Shenron's Riddle, but it is called Dragon Ball 3, and we just need to accept it. The text adventure parts were dropped from this game and replaced with cutscenes, but the random card element for exploration and combat were both kept. The board-like map now had more options on where you could go from the very start, making it seem a bit more open-ended, but the game remained largely the same. And this would be the last Dragon Ball game for a very long time, because from here, we have entered the Dragon Ball Z era. Having found a formula for making Dragon Ball games and with literally no competition or reason to change their methods, Bandai kept putting out games from the Goku series, but transitioned from the original Dragon Ball to Dragon Ball Z. With this transition, they dropped the board-like map and replaced it with more open sections that players could explore at will. Theoretically, it worked very similar, you still use the cards, but now it doesn't look like a board game anymore. It's starting to look a bit more like a proper map. The combat system received some animations as well, making fights look a bit more flashier, even if those animations were way too long and boring to watch over and over. That's what Dragon Ball Z was all about, flashy animations and never-ending battles. The first Dragon Ball Z covered the Saiyan saga with fights against Raditz, Nappa, and Vegeta. They even added a few movie and filler characters like Pumpkin. Remember Pumpkin? Yeah, me neither. The second game covers the Frieza saga, but for some reason Tien, Yamcha, and Chiaotzu are not dead, and they come along for the ride on the spaceship with Gohan and Krillin towards Namek. And the third game starts with Super Saiyan Goku defeating Frieza and mostly covers the Android saga. It ends in the battle of Piccolo against Imperfect Cell, so it doesn't really wrap things up on that whole arc. From here, the series got a little weird. For the first time, a game featured a fully original story. Dragon Ball's side story planned to eradicate the Saiyans, retained the gameplay elements from these previous games, but told a new story, which in its own way sprouted its own video game series and even an original video animation with the same name. And that's why the name of this game might be familiar to you. The game, the OVA, it was all built and released around the same time. But at this point, it was time to move on. The Super Nintendo was out. People were embracing this new generation of consoles, so Bandai needed to put some Dragon Ball games out on this next generation. But not before they released a really weird device and a Dragon Ball game to go along with it. The Bandai Detach was an accessory for the NES that came packaged with a game, Dragon Ball Z Gekito Tenkaichi Budokai. Words that might be familiar to you because of the PlayStation 2 games, but we're definitely not talking about the same games. The Detach was able to read physical cards that you would buy at a game store. After you scan one of those cards, the game would read the barcode and select a character for you in-game. Characters had different health points, energy, attack power, which made the game extremely unbalanced, as the difference between characters was sometimes abysmal, which also made this the first pay-to-win Dragon Ball game. Or, if you want to have a more positive outlook, this was Bandai's amiibo way before its time. Call them visionaries or greedy scumbags, but for all intents and purposes, this was actually the first Dragon Ball fighting game ever made. And as for the Detach, it was discontinued with only 7 games officially supporting it in its lifetime. The history of Dragon Ball games continues on the SNES, where a new fighting game series emerged and their Goku series evolved. Also, new consoles are arriving. The Genesis, the Playdia, the Sega Saturn, and the first PlayStation are just around the corner. So stay tuned for part 2 of the history and evolution of Dragon Ball games, coming out next week. Boy.